Hollywood keeps trying to make westerns bigger, but somehow they just keep getting dumber. One of these movies spent nearly $200 million on singing cows. Another burned so much cash it killed a studio. And the most expensive one ever is an all-time disaster Disney still hasn't recovered from. These are the 10 most ridiculously expensive westerns ever made, and proof that money doesn't buy success. This one's a more dramatized take on the western genre. It's about a teenage girl, played by Scarlett Johansson, who survives a horrific horse riding accident but loses part of her leg. Her mother, desperate to help her recover, takes her to see Tom Brooker, played by Robert Redford, the so-called horse whisperer, a guy who has this almost mystical ability to heal traumatized horses. But as he helps the horse, he also helps her. It's not a typical western. No shootouts, no outlaws, none of the explosive action you'd expect. But thematically it fits right in. It's all about survival, resilience, and the bond between people and the land. Classic western ideas, just told in a more intimate way. And this was a huge production. The budget was around $115 million when adjusted for inflation, and for what it was, it did okay at the box office. When John Wayne made the Alamo in 1960, he wasn't just making a western, he was making what he saw as an American epic. He directed it, starred in it, and poured everything into it, telling the story of the legendary 1836 battle between Mexico and the Republic of Texas. And this was one of the biggest Western productions ever at the time. They built a 3/4 scale replica of the Alamo mission just for the film. The budget, adjusted for inflation, was about $128 million, and you can see where the money went. The production was massive, and it was praised for its authenticity, at least in terms of the sets and battle sequences. Critically, it did well. It got 7 Academy Award nominations, but commercially it flopped. Audiences just didn't connect with it the way Wayne expected. Still, as a historical epic, it's one of the most ambitious westerns ever made. 44 years later, Hollywood tried again. This time, instead of the grand mythic version of events, the 2004 remake aimed for a more grounded, historically accurate take on the Battle of the Alamo. It wasn't about larger-than-life heroics, it focused on the actual people, including Billy Bob Thornton as Davy Crockett and Jason Patric as Jim Bowie. And while the approach was different, the budget was just as massive. When adjusted for inflation, about $130 million. But it bombed too, grossed less than $30 million worldwide, making it one of the biggest box office disasters in movie history. And critics were split on it. The film is a great example of the challenge in balancing historical accuracy with compelling drama. Strip away too much of the mythology, and you risk losing the audience. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened here. Lawrence Kasdan's Wyatt Earp is one of the most ambitious takes on the legendary lawman ever put to screen. This isn't just about the gunfight at the OK Corral. It's a full-blown biographical epic, covering Earp's life from his early days as a rancher all the way to his rise as one of the most famous figures in the Old West. And with a 3-hour runtime, the film really digs into who he was beyond just the myth. But ambition doesn't always translate to success. The budget, adjusted for inflation, was around $145 million, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Tombstone had come out just a few months earlier, and that film was faster, more action-packed, and, let's be honest, just more fun. So when Wyatt Earp hit theaters, audiences weren't interested. It earned just $56 million worldwide. This is one of the most brutal, intense westerns ever made. The Revenant tells the true story of Hugh Glass, a frontiersman who gets mauled by a bear and left for dead by his own men. But instead of dying, he drags himself across the frozen wilderness, fueled by nothing but survival instinct and the need for revenge. And making this movie was absolute hell. The production had a budget of around $151 million, and almost everything was shot in natural light, meaning the cast and crew were constantly battling freezing temperatures and rough conditions. Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't just acting. He was out there eating raw bison liver, wading through icy rivers, and barely surviving the shoot himself. But in the end, it paid off. The film was a massive success, both critically and commercially, and it finally got DiCaprio his first Oscar. When people talk about Heaven's Gate, they're usually not talking about the movie itself. They're talking about the absolute disaster that was its production. After The Deer Hunter, Michael Cimino was riding high, so the studio basically handed him a blank check and let him do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was big. The movie is based on the Johnson County War, a real-life conflict in 1890s Wyoming between wealthy land barons and European immigrants. But here's the problem. Cimino's vision was so ambitious, so expensive, that the whole thing spiraled out of control. The budget skyrocketed to what would be about $163 million today. And his directing style was completely authoritarian. He demanded endless takes, built entire towns from scratch, and drove the production into chaos. The result was a box office bomb so massive that Hollywood basically stopped letting directors have full creative control over big-budget movies. This was the film that killed the era of director-driven filmmaking. Over the years, Heaven's Gate has been reassessed. Some people even call it a masterpiece. But back in 1980, it was an industry-shaking failure. This one's not the first thing that comes to mind when people think of westerns, but Rango is a western through and through. It's about a chameleon, voiced by Johnny Depp, who accidentally stumbles into a lawless desert town, lies his way into becoming sheriff, and then has to live up to the legend he just made up. And beyond all the slapstick and weird humor, the movie actually has some surprisingly deep themes about identity and belonging. Financially, this thing was huge. Adjusted for inflation, the budget was around $180 million, but unlike some of the other big-budget westerns on this list, Rango was a massive success. It was critically acclaimed, it crushed at the box office, and it won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. This was Disney's last hurrah for 2D animation before they fully switched to CGI, and what they went with was an animated western about cows, specifically a group of farm animals led by a cow named Maggie, voiced by Roseanne Barr, who try to save their farm by catching an infamous cattle rustler. It's a weird setup, but that's what they went with. This was not a cheap movie to make. The hand-drawn animation, the musical numbers, by the time it was done, the budget had hit what would now be around $194 million. Somewhat expectedly, it flopped. The movie didn't make back its budget, critics weren't impressed, and it pretty much marked the end of Disney's 2D animated era. But in hindsight, it's kind of a quirky, underrated entry in the genre. Not a classic, but definitely a unique take on the Western. A Western with aliens. This was one of the most ambitious genre mashups Hollywood ever attempted. You've got Daniel Craig playing an amnesiac outlaw, Harrison Ford as this grizzled cattleman, and the two of them have to team up to take on an alien invasion in the Old West. The setup alone is wild. It's got a mix of classic Western tropes and full-on sci-fi action, and for a moment, it looked like it might be a massive hit. But it wasn't. Despite all the big names involved, Jon Favreau directing, Steven Spielberg producing, it just didn't land with audiences and barely made its budget back. This one is legendary for all the wrong reasons. Gore Verbinski, coming off the success of Rango, decided to take on the Lone Ranger, with Armie Hammer as the masked hero and Johnny Depp as Tonto. And this thing was big. Trains, explosions, massive set pieces, it had everything. But it also had endless delays, reshoots, and a budget that ballooned to an absolutely insane $294 million when adjusted for inflation. The result was one of the biggest box office bombs in history. The movie just never clicked with audiences. The 160-minute runtime was way too long for what should have been a fun, pulpy action adventure. And then there was the controversy. Casting Depp, a white actor, as a Native American character was not well received. At the end of the day, The Lone Ranger is proof that throwing a ton of money at a Western doesn't guarantee success. It had some cool moments, but financially it was a disaster for Disney.